can say this right off the cuff. Tom Holland is not the best Spider-Man today. Yes. I think a fire just started somewhere. I think a volcano erupted somewhere. Something happened somewhere. And I know, most of you are going to go in my comment section and just start typing away. Wait a minute. Let me explain. He should be the best Spider-Man, but he's not. Why? This is what I'm going to explain. So stay tuned as I break this down to you. Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Izukanji Kashiwa here, but since we're all friends, you can call me Izu. Alright, if you're new here, I talk movies, TV shows, music, gaming, basically everything entertainment. If you're into all of that stuff, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon just so that you can get that content first. Yeah, do all that. Today, I want to talk to you guys about Spider-Man. Yes, I'm a huge Spider-Man fan. I've always been since as far back as I can remember. So, who is your favorite Spider-Man? Quickly hit me up in the comment section. Tell me who your favorite Spider-Man is. And for this particular video, I'm just going to look at the live action Spider-Man, because the best Spider-Man for me were in the animated movies and series. I just want to specifically look at the live action movies. That's it. So I'm talking Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and the current Spider-Man, Tom Holland. So there's a couple of ways you can dissect this, figure out why a particular one of these actors pulled it off, the one that checks off all the boxes. All of these movies are character based, they're character driven. I'm going to be purely basing this on the character arc because I believe that's the most important thing in movies like this. If that doesn't hold water, the whole thing falls apart, because that's what connects us. Even when you're reading the comics, back in the day as kids, in a corner somewhere in primary school, when you're reading the comics, the story and how the character was developing in the story and the decisions they make along the way and what builds them and what creates that person that becomes into the ultimate superhero that you fall in love with, that is what made, above all the action sequences and graphics and everything, the story, the arc of the character is what made them who they are, and that's why we fell in love with them. When the first movies came out, I was very curious to see how the character is portrayed. And the first movies came out, I think that was 2002. The first movies came out and Tobey Maguire played Spider-Man. Before this point, I had no idea who Tobey Maguire is. I don't think I'd seen him in anything before Spider-Man. So we get introduced to the character. He's in high school. He's this quirky, nerdy kid, this socially awkward teenage high school kid. Immediately you see him, you associate him with the character that we read back in the comic books, and that for me was very powerful because of that nostalgic element that I could relate to the character almost immediately I saw him, which I think was a very accurate depiction of Spider-Man as a character, just from the Peter Parker's demeanor and his mannerisms and everything. I think that was spot on with Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, just when you get introduced to the character. So that was great. Andrew Garfield, we get introduced to his version of Spider-Man in The Amazing Spider-Man. I think that was 2012. I think he is more confident than Peter Parker should be. He is less quirky. He is more cool in the very beginning. Even before he becomes Spider-Man, he is more cool and a little too confident to be Peter Parker. So for me, he was less believable compared to Maguire. That's a take on just his demeanor and his mannerisms, just when you get to meet Peter Parker in the first few scenes of The Amazing Spider-Man. And then Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man is introduced to us in Captain America Civil War. And immediately you see him as Peter Parker. He's relatable. Tom Holland is the right age. I think he was cast while he was still a teenager. He's not anymore, of course, but fits perfectly. His mannerisms, his social awkwardness, his quirkiness and nerdy behavior is spot on. And he should be the best Spider-Man. He should. Looking at the character on first glance, these two, Tobey Maguire and Tom Holland, have a spot-on depiction of Spider-Man as we know him from the comic books or earlier depictions in the animated movies and series. For me, they pull that off more than Andrew Garfield. Andrew Garfield doesn't give me that, I want to be on this guy's side or I'm rooting for this guy. He's too cool and confident for in the initial stages of just meeting Peter Parker. For me, that's my take. There's a point where Flash is pounding on some kid and he asks him to take a picture and he intervenes. Peter Parker doesn't insert himself into a fight at the beginning of his character arc. He's just a kid who hasn't yet developed that hero mentality. I don't think he's that person in the beginning. Garfield's Spider-Man is no way exactly smooth with the girls, no, but he's a little too confident with the girls. He's a little too confident as an individual, which isn't a very accurate depiction of Peter Parker in the very beginning of his story, I don't think. So for me, that felt, just upon meeting the character, for me that felt a bit off. So already in the very beginning, my guard went up as I was getting to know the character and watching him develop. There was already that he's a little too well put together already for me to be rooting for him. Don't get me wrong, he's very smart, IQ off the charts, he's a science whiz, but he doesn't let that come off. That doesn't come off as confidence. So for me, Maguire pulls that off, Holland pulls that off. Garfield doesn't quite nail Peter Parker, who he is in the beginning. I don't think he does. That, I think, is the point where he lost me as a lover of this character, as a lover of film in general. For me, that's where he lost me, or started losing me at least. We need to talk about Uncle Ben. Any version ever told, Uncle Ben, Aunt May and Uncle Ben, but mostly Uncle Ben, is a pivotal role in Spider-Man becoming the version of hero he becomes. The events that occur around Uncle Ben, the relationship that he has with Uncle Ben and Aunt May, they play a huge role in the arc of this character. Without them, a lot of things would have been different. And I think this was deliberately written that way, that he has this perfect role model that he is following. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man portrays this probably best among the three, Maguire, Garfield, and Holland. I think Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man nails this perfectly. The relationship with Uncle Ben and how it's portrayed. When you initially just get introduced to their characters in the movie, you know these play a huge role in his life and who he becomes, the man he becomes, but more importantly, the superhero he becomes, the kind of superhero he becomes. They play a cardinal role in that. You can tell from the very first time you lay eyes on Aunt May and Uncle Ben and the chemistry between Maguire and Aunt May and Uncle Ben. You can tell almost instantly that this is going to be a very important relationship in the development of the Peter Parker character. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man also has an incredible relationship with his aunt and his uncle, Aunt May and Uncle Ben. They have a great relationship, and that is portrayed, but not as well. I think they focus more in Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man character. They focus more on the disappearance of his parents. You can tell from the very beginning of the movie, The Amazing Spider-Man, the focus was more on how the disappearance of his parents affected him than how the relationship with Uncle Ben and Aunt May and the events that occurred with those two in his life affected the man who he became. I think the focus is more on his parents, or more on his parents' abrupt departure as it's portrayed in the movie. I'm not particularly mad at that narrative because I think it would have worked. I don't think it did, by the way. It would have worked if it was executed in a different way, but I don't think it was properly executed, and that narrative, for me, did not work. Because already here's the thing about huge characters that have got an established story. It's a fine line that you have to walk if you have to blur the edges between what is known for years, decades even, as the character's arc, and the things that occurred in the character's life that made them who they become. If you have to divert that from that narrative, even just for a little bit, you have to be very careful, and you have to play it so well that it doesn't deter your audience from the original narrative or the popular narrative that we know. We meet Tom Holland's Spider-Man for the first time 6 months after he had gained his powers. Tom Holland's Spider-Man, his relationship with his parents, we don't really know. We don't get to see it. It's hinted and mentioned here and there, but we don't really get to see his actual relationship, especially with Uncle Ben, because this happens 6 months after his Spider-Man. So Uncle Ben is not in the picture. They have a great relationship. He has a great relationship with his Aunt May, and there's very little mention of Uncle Ben. And that, for me, that didn't sit too well with me, because Uncle Ben is a very cardinal role in Spider-Man and Peter Parker's story, becoming the version of Spider-Man that he becomes. And even when he sort of finds it difficult to navigate that superhero life, it always goes back to the values that were instilled in him by Uncle Ben and Aunt May, but especially Uncle Ben and the relationship that he had with him. The Daily Bugle. Only one of these movies get to show us the Daily Bugle. How do we have a Spider-Man without the Daily Bugle? J.K. Simmons is great as the editor of the Daily Bugle. I think it was great that they threw that in there. William Dafoe is the bad guy. He plays Goblin, and I think he nails it. Perfect bad guy. You guys know I love bad guys, and I love it when the perfect actor pulls off perfect version of the bad guy. I think Goblin was perfectly executed by William Dafoe. When we look at Tom Holland's Spider-Man, also the villain is great. Michael Keaton plays Adrian Toomes, Vulture. But when we get to meet the villain in Garfield's Spider-Man, brilliantly played by Rhys Ifans. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Dr. Connors, Rhys Ifans just takes me back to Spike from Notting Hill. I couldn't take him too seriously. Yeah, so that's the villain. Let's move on. Let's look at their love interests. Tobey Maguire, his version of Spider-Man. Kirsten Dunst plays MJ perfectly. MJ in the beginning is this party girl, this wild girl, maybe a little too wild for Peter Parker. I think from the comic books, that's why he breaks up with her and starts to date Gwen Stacy. Tobey Maguire has great chemistry on screen with Kirsten Dunst. MJ is an important part of the Spider-Man story. You can't tell a Spider-Man story without MJ. She was initially written as his temporal love interest. After he breaks up with her, he was supposed to end up with Gwen Stacy for the rest of his life in the comic books. But the fans were so in love with Mary Jane Watson's character that they pushed and pushed until Stan Lee and his other collaborators decided to make MJ his permanent love interest. And after Gwen Stacy dies, there's a timeline where they even get married, all of that good stuff. The best version of the love story of MJ and Peter Parker is definitely told in the 2002 version of Spider-Man, the Tobey Maguire version of Spider-Man. Garfield's version of Spider-Man focuses on his relationship with Gwen Stacy, which is also pulled off very well, except the only problem I have with that is at some point it just becomes like a rom-com montage where the only thing that you get to see for a while in the movie is Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy and the love story. It turns into a teen rom-com at some point, but the chemistry is great. Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man, his love interest is Liz. I'm not quite sure the Liz character and what that narrative was. MJ is in the movies, but they have the most weird relationship with Peter in Homecoming. MJ, played by Zendaya, they have the most weird relationship in the movie. Their chemistry is just weird. There's something there, but it's more weird than hot. That's as much as I can say about that. Tobey Maguire, at the end of the first movie, walks away from Mary Jane because, again, the lesson that Uncle Ben taught him, with great power comes great responsibility. He realizes the responsible thing to do is to walk away in order to protect her. He cares about her, but it's more responsible to walk away from her and protect her from what's about to come. When he realizes, after defeating the Green Goblin, he realizes this is my life now, and if I'm going to help people, if I'm going to be this superhero, I have to protect the people that are close to me from these villains that I will definitely encounter in the future. And he walks away from MJ, still going back to Uncle Ben and what he taught him and how important those lessons were to the man he was supposed to be. Garfield also walks away from Gwen Stacy. He also does the responsible thing. So basically, with everything that I have said, we can sum it up. For me, when I'm watching these movies, I look at the character arc. That's what makes me love these movies. When you look at Iron Man, you look at Thor, you look at Doctor Strange. When you look at these characters, You love them because of what they've been through. You have this emotional attachment to them. Strange was in an accident and went through so much just to get back, him discovering who he was meant to be, rather. Same thing with Tony Stark or Captain America, Steve Rogers, or any of the other heroes. So for me, Andrew Garfield was, when you look at the three, the worst portrayal of Spider-Man in any sense. They tried to fix his mannerisms and his character in the second one, but then, like I said, you have to develop an emotional attachment in the beginning to a character for you to start rooting for him. And because that wasn't established in Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, the Amazing Spider-Man, that made him the least likable Spider-Man. Even though he had an entire character arc, the execution of what they were doing, they went a little off the tracks with that version. That's why I think Garfield's Spider-Man is the least likable. It was poorly executed, but it didn't come together for me. Tobey Maguire's portrayal of Spider-Man, you see every part of his journey. It becomes impossible for you not to be rooting for him, because you see him when he's just this kid who's being bullied on the bus by Flash. You see him develop into Spider-Man. You see him get bitten. You see him learning to be Spider-Man, designing his own costume and learning how to shoot his spiderweb. All of these things add up to a story. For me, with Tom Holland's depiction of Spider-Man, there's a chunk of time missing that we don't get to see, and that doesn't sit very well with me. For characters like this, as I've explained, the character arc is so important. The development of the character is so important, because that's what keeps us, the audience, invested in the character. Because we understand the journey the character has been through, we are invested. And the reason I find myself not being invested in Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man is because we haven't experienced anything with him. We haven't been through that journey with him. We are not there when he actually gets bit by the spider. We are not there when he tries out to learn how to become Spider-Man. Even the emotional connection that I'm supposed to have with the character isn't exactly there, because I have not experienced anything with Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man. He works in the Avengers movies because there are all of these characters around him. And notice this, when you look at Captain America, Steve Rogers, when he's still just Steve Rogers, this skinny kid in Brooklyn, you know where he starts from and what he has to go through, and the person he is, even when he's just Steve Rogers, the struggle he has to go through just to get into the army, and how he wants to prove himself not only to other people but to himself, what he loses, and all of that together makes us emotionally connected to the character. Look at Doctor Strange too. He's this world-renowned neurosurgeon, loses everything after his car accident, and the journey for us, we know who he is at the beginning of the movie and what tragedy does to him and what it transforms him to become. We are emotionally invested in these characters. Iron Man, Captain America, Doctor Strange. We are invested because as an audience, we feel we've experienced these things with them because we've seen their arc, we've seen their evolution. So we have that emotional attachment to them. I don't know why Tom Holland we didn't experience this with him. He should be, and I'll keep saying this, he should be the best Spider-Man, but he's not, because of this specific thing. His character arc, it was perfectly executed for the MCU, very poorly executed for Spider-Man. In the MCU, because of all these other characters, we are able to enjoy the Spider-Man that's there, because the MCU has already developed these other characters who we are emotionally invested in. But when it's a standalone movie and it's just him, it becomes very difficult to relate or even to root for him. You don't know this person. He's Peter Parker, yes, but every time you try to connect with the character, you have to insert a different version of him somewhere. When you want to connect with what he's been through, you have to insert Tobey Maguire's version of him somewhere, or Garfield's version of him somewhere, because we don't have a backstory for him that we saw. We have a backstory that we understand and have read and seen other depiction, but we needed to see Tom Holland's portrayal. We needed to associate him with something. We needed to have an emotional attachment to him for us to be emotionally invested. but we hadn't been through anything with him. He was already Spider-Man. Everything before that was skipped, and it works for the MCU, but it falls flat for the standalone movie, which is a shame. Again, he should be the best Spider-Man because he checks off all the boxes. He's got the banter down, he's got the physique down, he's got the appearance down. Everything is perfect. He is the perfect Spider-Man. Except it's difficult for me as a person in the audience to connect with him emotionally. Uncle Ben, who I have said earlier, I believe is one of the most cardinal roles, and the events that surround Uncle Ben are some of the most important events in Peter Parker's life. The man he becomes, the superhero he becomes, has got a lot to do with the events that occur around Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and the relationship he has with these two. In Tobey Maguire's portrayal, the 2002 movie, you see Uncle Ben teaching probably the biggest lesson in the entire Spider-Man series. With great power comes great responsibility. We say this now casually, but that was one of the most cardinal roles that Uncle Ben told Peter Parker. And it was very important for the man he was going to be and the superhero he was going to be. Same thing for Garfield's version of Spider-Man. He also gets not the exact version of with great power comes great responsibility, but he still tells them that in a different way. He says to him, when you have the power to do something, you should. Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man as well has that instilled in him, because he says it at some point to Tony Stark when he comes to recruit him during Civil War, sorry. But again, with Tom Holland's character, we don't get to see all of these events. So again, there's chunks missing for us. We don't get to see Uncle Ben actually tell him that, where you get to see him learn, and even before learning, make mistakes with that, and then learn that with great power comes great responsibility. Which for me becomes very frustrating, because I love Tom Holland as Spider-Man. He should be the best Spider-Man. But because there's a chunk of things that mentally, as I am watching his portrayal of Spider-Man, I have to fill in a lot of blanks with other characters, with other versions of Spider-Man. Still don't understand why Marvel didn't give him a standalone movie just before Civil War so that we get that perfect character arc. I still don't get it. Marvel, I don't get it. Tobey Maguire's portrayal of Spider-Man and how the death of Uncle Ben affected who he was. The death of Uncle Ben should be the most pivotal role in any of the Spider-Man adaptations, because it's what evolved him to become Spider-Man. And I don't mean it's what made him become a superhero. No, I mean it's what made him become the superhero that we fell in love with. It's what made him have compassion and try to look out for the little guy, try to help people that couldn't help themselves. That's what made him our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. When Uncle Ben is shot, there's a lesson that translates into the person that he becomes. In any version of Spider-Man, those scenes where Uncle Ben gets killed, they're the hardest for me to watch. The ugly cries are sad. Let's put them back to back, see who had the ugliest cry. I'm not really going to do that. Or am I? All of those things just give you this affinity for the character. You want this character to win. Sadly, we don't get to see this in Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man. It's acknowledged and even hinted a little bit, but Uncle Ben being the cardinal part of who Peter Parker becomes is sort of neglected, and I understand why, because Tony Stark is who is portrayed in the MCU as Spider-Man's mentor. Cutting out the death of Uncle Ben takes out a lot in it, and this is where Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man shines, because in that moment he learns the lesson. In Uncle Ben's death, the mantra that he sort of handed down to him rings louder than ever, because the thing that ends up gunning down Uncle Ben is the guy he lets go in both Tobey Maguire's version of Spider-Man and Garfield's version of Spider-Man. He had the power to stop that guy. If he had, Uncle Ben would still be alive. The fact that he let him go somehow led to his uncle dying. So he learns that, and you watch him learn that. You see this emotional event happen as you're watching it, and he's experiencing it. You are sort of taking through that journey with him. Same thing with Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. When Uncle Ben is gunned down, the guy that kills him is the guy he lets go at a shop that steals money from the clerk who was being a jerk to Peter Parker. So he decides to let the guy go. The guy runs out of the store and on the streets shoots Uncle Ben. He learns the same lesson. He had the responsibility to do something. He had the power, to do something and didn't. And there were consequences to that. Peter Parker, in both Garfield's version and Maguire's version, learned a very vital lesson. And that is something that goes on till the Spider-Man we know today. With great power comes great responsibility. That has always been what defined the hero Spider-Man came to be. Again, in Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man, all of this is assumed. None of this is actually shown. They just assume we know this. And we do know this. At least most people know this. Those that are watching this type of movies may have even read the comics. But it's not about that. It's not about Spider-Man in an introduction of the character. It's about the actor that plays the character. We are supposed to associate that emotion that comes with losing an uncle, watching your uncle get gunned down on the street, and realizing that the person you let go is responsible for it. Watching that emotion and how it changes who Peter Parker is and later on becomes is important. It's just not there in Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man. It's all just assumed. In Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man, he's more defined by Tony Stark. And this works in the MCU, but it sort of falls apart when it's a standalone movie, because it's got nothing to do with Tony Stark. It's Spider-Man in Queens, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He should be the best. He just doesn't have a background that we can relate to. His background we have to fill in with Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. Again, it comes back to the same thing. I can't get emotionally invested in Tom Holland's character. As much as I love him, as much as I want him to be Spider-Man, I cannot, it's difficult for me to relate to him because I haven't experienced this journey with him. He's just a guy that I'm meeting and he already has everything happening and they just tell us the backstory. It's not good enough for me. Yeah, so we get to see Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man go through his entire character arc, and this gives us this emotional affinity towards the character and towards the person himself. Every time we see him, we have a point of reference. We experienced his development, so we are attached to the character. And this is what, for me, makes Tobey Maguire the best Spider-Man today. Tobey Maguire's character arc is the strongest among the three, and for me, that's why he is the best Spider-Man. If you like this video, hit the like button below, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and as always, dare to be great. See what happens. Peace.